Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Intelligent Comic Book Investor. This is the podcast where passion meets investing, and I'm your host, Vince, with ReallyBadComics. And today, we're going to dive into one of the most important concepts in comic book investing, and that's the optimal investment grade, or as I like to call it, the O.I.G. So listen, whether you're new to the hobby or a seasoned collector, understanding the optimal investment grade, it's really going to highlight how collectors and investors approach the hobby completely different. So, they say, what comics should I buy? Well, they always say, don't focus on the grade, focus on the comic. And it's my experience that people will go buy the comic they want and just typically buy the grade that's available at the price they can afford. That's not a good approach to comic book investing, and I'm going to explain why. The grade and the comic are both really, really important. So comic books are graded on a scale of 0.5 to 10.0, but not every grade delivers the exact same kind of return. 9.8, as an example, might be the prettiest comic out there, but it's also the most expensive. And it's also one of the most has the most volatility, and there's huge price swings with a 9.8. But on the other hand, a 2.0 might be affordable, but for investors, the comic may sit for a time because it's more of I would say a collector's grade. Someone who just wants the comic rather than an investor's grade. So this leads us to talk about this concept of optimal investment grade. And it's the sweet spot where affordability, demand, and long-term growth intersect. So let's break down like the economics of an optimal investment grade. So there are three major forces at play. We want to buy something that has liquidity. Okay, how many buyers exist for that particular grade? An optimal investment grade will attract the most amount of buyers at a price that investors can afford. There might not be a lot of liquidity at a 9.8, and there might not be a lot of liquidity at like a 2.0 either, depending on the comic. So the first thing, you've got to consider liquidity. Second thing, growth rate. Now, this is a data point that may not have I don't think a lot of people understand growth rate as it relates to a comic. And basically, it's a data point that shows which grades have historically outperformed. A lot of people will tell you this is not important. Mentors of mine, I think, will tell you that it's not important. However, I think it's a data point that you should consider. And optimal investment grades have lower risk and volatility than the very highest grades. And I'm going to show you an example of that and why I think it's important. The third thing, you want to consider scarcity versus accessibility. Ultra high grades are very scarce, but often they're priced out of reach. Like Amazing Fantasy 15 sold for $3 million. I don't personally know anyone who would be able to purchase an Amazing Fantasy 15 at a 9.6 grade for $3 million. Now, optimal investment grades try to balance scarcity with like a realistic entry point. And so when you put these things together, like an optimal investment grade typically sits in a $5,000 to $10,000 range. And from a grade perspective, this might be like a 4.0 to 7.5 range for Golden Age keys, 6.0 to 9.0 for like Silver Age keys, and probably in the Bronze Age, a 9.4 to 9.6. Now, I told you about like one of my mentors. So Sean from Reserved Investments. He's a man that I've paid him for consultant work. He's someone I consider a mentor on this topic. He'll also tell you that an optimal investment grade is usually the top 50% of any particular book. And that includes a 9.8 could be an investment grade for like a modern age or copper age book, but probably not for like a bronze, silver, or golden age book. So the top 15% is something that also fits with what we're talking about here. So let's make this real with some examples here. So if I compare, like for instance, a Werewolf by Night 32 and a Batman 32, you'll see that a Werewolf by Night 32 in 2015 sold for $14,450 in for a 9.8, and in 2025 recently sold for $21,600. This is a 4.1 compounded annual growth rate. Basically, this is what, if you sold this today, your growth rate would be 4.1% compounded annually. Now, if we look at this from a 9.6, a 9.6 in 2015 sold for $3,688. That same book in a 9.6 in 2025 sold for $7,432. So your return on investment was actually greater. You could have potentially bought 2 of these, or 3 of these, or even 4 of these for what you bought the 9.8 at, and that compounding of 7.3% would be way more beneficial for you if you'd purchased at this rate. And if we go down to a 9.4 for Werewolf by Night 32, $1,800 would have been what it would cost you in 2015. And in 2025, you could have sold that for $3,300, which is a compounded annual growth rate of 6%. So regardless of whether you're at a 9.4 or 9.6, it actually outperformed the 9.8 at 4.1%. And if we look at Batman 232, so this is Neil Adams, the first appearance of Ra's al Ghul. Pretty similar situation here, but not always. So for instance, at a 9.8, if you had bought this in 2015 for $3,100 and you sold it in 2025 for $9,100, your compounded annual growth rate would have been 11.4%, which is actually really good. A 9.6, you could have bought this for $1,250, sold it for $4,100, and actually the 9.6 not way outperformed, but it outperformed the 9.8. Again, you could have bought, let's say, 2 of these, and you would have made way more money, a bit more money with your 9.6 than you would have with the 9.8. Now, where this becomes a fallacy is like a 9.4, you would have bought this for $938, and in 2025 sold it for $1,500. It's only a 4.8% return. So there's no cash. There's no cash underlays for these books. It's not like they're stocks. At best, it would be similar to like gold or silver, or Bitcoin or some type of crypto, something like that. But with regard to these books, a 9.4 probably wouldn't be your optimal investment grade for the 232. But you can easily see that a 9.6 in either Batman 232 or Werewolf by Night 32 was the best purchase you could have made, and at a price that is way more affordable than certainly this from a $14,000 perspective, and this for a $3,100 perspective. And it gives you more money to invest in, like, money market accounts, stocks. Take that if here you could have taken that other $2,000 and put it into an ETF, earning money against the stock market, so your return would have been better that way. So a lot of times collectors get really wrapped up into this idea that they got to have the best. It's got to be pristine. And that's great for collectors. But if you're wanting to actually produce a return on these kind of investments, it really makes sense for you to not look at necessarily the top, but something in a 9.6, especially in a in the Bronze Age. And 9.4 would have performed great here, but just not here. You couldn't have known that when you purchased it. So as a result, you have you don't always need to see the highest grade to see the best returns. Now, another way that collectors differ from investors not in just what they collect is that investors, or actually this may be one way where they're alike. Investors aren't always purely rational. So there's two things you need to keep in mind when you're investing in comic books. First, there's the endowment effect. The endowment effect makes collectors overvalue the books they already own. So it's like, man, I can't sell this right now because it might go up way even higher. Listen, if you've produced, in my opinion, a 10% return on your investment, that's in line with the stock market. If you can do that, then if you think you can produce or you can produce a 10% return, that's a great time to sell. Take that money and roll it into something else that, maybe would be another great investment, or take a portion of it, move that 10% into a money market account or an ETF, and then take the core amount and buy another comic book with it. The endowment effect is going to get in your way to doing that. If you're going to just value what you have, what you already own, and don't look at, listen, I need to take the returns now. That's something that you're going to need to guard against and use discipline to do it. The other thing is this something called the sunk cost fallacy. This keeps people holding on to poor purchases simply because they paid too much. So recognizing that you probably should sell these. I recently went through this with where I had to make a decision like to sell my Amazing Fantasy 15, and I talked about that in another video. Listen, I don't think it was a poor purchase, but I paid too much for that. I needed to sell that book and use that money in ways that was better for me. And when I sold that book, I immediately went to books that I thought had an optimal investment grade, and it really helped me cut through the biases. And instead of chasing the prettiest slab, if you focus on the data, the actual book itself, how liquid the book is, the growth rates, and the affordability, those are the things going to help you keep from your emotions literally sabotaging your portfolio. So how do you apply this? Well, let me show you. So listen, so we look at famous funnies. This is a Frank Frazetta cover and story. He did the art. And Frank Frazetta listen, he's always been hot. But using Frank as an example here to highlight the difference between an investor and a collector, I think is going to be really important. Because an investor and a collector would both love these books. So Famous Funnies 211, Famous Funnies 209. These are classic Frank Frazetta, Buck Rogers covers and stories. So if we look at these books, we'll go to Heritage, and we see that this book at a 5.5 sold for $1,440. And the 209 sold for this 4.5 sold for $840. Now, when we look at the 211 at a 5.5, what you'll see is that the fair market value of this is $1,400, which is practically exactly for what it sold, including the buyer's premium. Now, what's the problem with that? So a collector is going to look at that and say, I just want it. I just want it. But they don't look at the fact, like, listen, they could have had if they held out, perhaps they could have got a 6.0 or a 6.5. They could have had a better quality book if they decided, listen, I'm not going to spend this money on this. All the way up to, and here, like the 7.0, it sold this year for $2,220. Like for another $700, you could have gone up from a 5.5 all the way up to probably a 7.5. And so what would be the optimal investment grade here? Optimal investment grade is probably around 9.0, given the current market value for this. A 9.4 sold in 2020. This 11.95 sold in 2006. You throw those numbers out. But I think probably at least look at what the cost is for a 9.0. And if it's, listen, if the new market is for a 9.0, if it's, upwards of more than $10,000, then, listen, maybe an 8.5 is the right move. You don't really want to set the market. You want to buy into the market. And so that's how to look at these things. If we can do the same thing with the 209. So 209 at a 4.5 sold for $840. And if we go over here on Go Collect and go to 209 and look at a 4.5, $950. So they got a little bit of a bargain. But listen, would you rather have a 4.5 at, what was it, $840? Or 5.0 at, $975, or a 5.5 at $1,050, and you just keep going up, and you'll look and see, listen, what's the optimal investment grade here? 8.0 sold for $3,000. But would I pay for an 8.0 if the fair market value for an 8.5 is $8,300 or $3,300, and a 9.0 is $3,600? It just doesn't make sense. So this is how you use optimal investment grade and discipline to decide as an investor, what comic book do I want to invest in, but at what grade is just as important. Otherwise, what happen is that you're screwing yourself into accepting a book that doesn't have the type of liquidity, not the kind of return, because most every other investor is going to look at this and say, why would I buy this at 4.5? In my opinion, the folks who bought these books are collectors. They just wanted them. And they don't come up very often. I mean, the census is very light for these. But so what? Save your money and focus on the grade as well as the copy you want that's going to maximize your investment. Okay, to sum it up, optimal investment grade is about finding the balance. It's not too high, it's not too low. It's just right for growth, liquidity, and long-term performance. Listen, if you focus on the optimal investment grade, you'll build a portfolio that not only looks impressive, but it's also going to work for you financially. Okay, so that's it for today's episode of The Intelligent Comic Book Investor. I'm Vince with Really Bad Comic Books. Listen, if you enjoyed this breakdown, follow me on Instagram at ReallyBadComicBooks, or check out the resources on ReallyBadComicBooks.com. And listen, folks, I want to earn your like or subscribe. So if you don't like the video, if it's not useful, I don't want your thumbs up. I don't want your subscription. But if you did enjoy this video, please give me a thumbs up, give me a like, click the bell to be notified of my next video, and please subscribe. Folks, I want to build a community here. So to be perfectly candid, if you hate this shit, tell me in the comments. I will respond. Until next time, invest wisely, collect passionately, and remember, the smartest grade isn't always the highest one. Thank you for listening and watching. Cheers.